When Rahel opened our Congress, our conference here, and gave us an introduction, she said, in the end, and the incest taboo is passed on from generation to generation. Not just the incest taboo is being passed on, but many other attitudes, structures of rejection are passed on to the next generation. And also what Danielle said this morning, so a certain ability to perceive, openness in the pelvis, heart qualities, and a wide brain, an open, wide brain, is also by electromagnetic fields, and they go back to protein movements. They are being passed on to the next generation, and I thought that could be a very relaxing topic, that we look at it on a cellular biological level. And I'd like to take you into half an hour of an introduction into cellular biology, which shows us in the end how we can steer ourselves and not just influence our own life, but also that our children and children's children, their lives as well. Living and being alive means frequency swing. As we know, the whole universe is, and beyond the universe, from the very fine levels to the very coarse levels, on vibrations, and these vibrations are information. Living and being alive means an exchange of information, and always new composition of information, and that build on each other and that also repeat each other. And here I'd like to give you a fractal picture. This is as an inspiration, that if we're in the cell and we understand what happens in a cell, that there is an intention of life, that we can also transfer that to a human being, to relationships, the condition of our world, and even into what we are developing into. Our thoughts and emotions influencing the electromagnetic field of the cells, and all cell fields make up the electromagnetic field around the body, and this stands in exchange with the fields of others, other people, but also of everything that surrounds us, plants and animals and stones and mountains and air and the quantum field, and if we are conscious of it or not. And there, a quick visual inspiration. Our thoughts and emotions are influencing the electromagnetic field of others, of ourselves and of others around us. In the most minuscule, in regards to the cell, and the largest, there is this exchange of information, not by accident or just without selection, as it was pronounced by Darwin and his successors, but it happens focused, and it has direction, and it has a lot of intention. It's the intention of life itself that we can observe in the cells. In the cell, we can look at two roads of exchanging of information. One that is like a riverbed, that is passed on by the genes, and that which constantly moves thousandfold every second, and this is which gets passed on through epigenetics. The way through the genes is called genetics, with 4 bases, nucleic acid, and there are these like a rope ladder twisted genetic makeup, and which is called the DNA double helix, and this encodes all the proteins that we form and create in our body. The word protein comes from the Greek word protos, and it means of uttermost importance. And I think that's very fitting, because it's the proteins that supply the raw materials that our body can perfectly fits together in a 3-dimensional structure, and the proteins are also there and responsible that our physiology is functioning so fantastic and so intricate and magical. As a reminder, here we can see an image of one of the chromosomes which are present in every cell, and there's always an enlargement. You can see the chromatin thread that's rolled up, and that's wrapped around histones, which are proteins in the shape of little balls, and if you extend it more and enlarge it more, you can see this double helix, and then this little line is such a gene, which we'll look at even more further later. In genetics, there are rare changes. It's like the riverbed. If there are changes in genetics, then we call that a mutation, and if that makes an advantage in physiology, in survival, then read on and it gets passed on, and if there's a disadvantage, then it makes up about 5% of our illnesses. It's like a complete revolution in biology during the last 15 years, that also only with scientists here and here there is the knowledge. In conventional medicine, they still believe that we inherit our sicknesses and illnesses via the genes. In epigenetics, in 1 second there are 1,000-fold movements that are constantly changing of states in the cell and around the cell and around us, and to follow those and to turn them into valid information and send it to the cells. Epigenetics describes the functioning of regulation proteins which are on the double helix of DNA and that are either being activating or deactivating. Here also a little picture how you can imagine that. There is activating, regulating proteins and suppressing ones, and if they are on the DNA, this part of the genetic markup is being read or not being read. If we were to take the thread in one individual cell, make straight and unroll it, it would be long 2 meters. So the DNA strand, I'm 180, would be 2 meter long. I always find that very, very impressive. What our body is doing. The completely unrolled DNA of one body would be 150 times the distance between Earth and Sun. The complete DNA of 7 million human beings, if we pushed it together, we could hold it in one hand and it would have the size of a grain of rice. A misguidance in the area of epigenetic And that's really suspenseful. It makes up 95% of our illnesses. And how we can influence our epigenetics, that's what epigenetic is teaching us about our thoughts, about our feelings, about our attitudes towards life. And that's, I think, really the clue of what I like to tell you about. For example, we have the epigenetic scientists have found out that mice who carry an ill gene, an Avanti gene, if they get a certain nourishment, then their offspring is healthy, even though they have the same gene. And until now, scientific standard was that once you have the gene, you get ill, and again here a picture. Here is a big fat yellow mice, and the yellow mice is the mother and is ill, has a very strong disturbance in, and the little brown mouse is the daughter and it also has that gene but is healthy and is also has not become ill during its life in the laboratory. Insights in epigenetics show that changes in, for example, with nutrition or style of life, thoughts and feelings, and also self-knowledge and meditation, how that would influence our physical hardware, meaning our DNA. They can repair faults stored and can activate sleeping genes and genes that cause illness. They can be deactivated. What we have always known is now been proven into the very cellular structure that our relationship to friends, family, our sexual practices, spiritual practices, sports activities and real true psychotherapy can change structural informational changes into the cells. If I say directly and within short time, I'd like to give you an example. There's an American physician, Dean Ornish. He was treating prostata patients, and alone with sports and a change of nutrition, and 90 days later he tested them and the activity of 500 genes had been changed. I don't know if you've heard this. There is a time travel experiment. 40 men ages 70 to 80 went into a hotel, and they were there for 4 days, and in this hotel everything was fitted like in their use, like the furniture, the television that they watched, the sports events were those of those days, the music were of such as of those days, and after 4 days they came out and were measured, and somebody who went in with a stick had a lot more energy when he got out, had different feelings, they looked more useful. They did this one more time with the same result. So 4 days of an inspiration of their own use has had an effect all the way onto the cellular level and brought about a big healing effect. On the other hand, via the path of epigenetics is also stress having an effect, conflicts, violence, traumata, but also environmental poisons, electrosmog, viruses and bacteria. They also influence our genes. Our genes, they can feel when they get triggered. They can be separated into genes that are dependent on activities. That comes from our patterns, our everyday routines, and they get put down through those, and new experiences, learning to open up for something new, something unexpected, consciousness enhancement, contact with the unknown will drive these genes upwards. And so it's not a surprise, but it's again suspenseful that on the cellular level you can find this again. Routines and things we're doing that we are used to, they put these genes down, and these genes that are dependent on behavior are activated or deactivated by certain activities, activating our friendship, support, well-meaning, love, being content, and all that brings down stress. And unhealthy is everything that has to do with stress, anger, enmity, competition, shame, guilt, hopelessness, powerlessness, just to name a few. How close all our relationships in life are being related and come together. I made a little slide here. Mostly it's about the time part in the middle as our competence. That's a self-regulating competence, and it means actually the gift of epigenetics, that in all directions we can take influence on our well-being, on our thoughts, on our ability to meditate, the depths of meditation, for example, how far we can open ourselves, how far we can rewrite old patterns or resolve them. All that opens us the door. Epigenetic really opens the door for us. Via epigenetic, there are especially our thoughts and feelings, and connect themselves with the body, and in this, it's the interface between spirit and body. On one hand, that's a very important interface on the path of freedom, to become a free energy, that old programming can resolve themselves. And on the other hand, in therapy, it's also a very important path, because there we can, in trauma therapy, we can resolve traumata. And also for the normal neurotic, I find that again and again we are in loops that keep repeating themselves, so that one can go onto the cellular level of programming and go down into these programming of these loops and can have an effect there. About the regulating proteins on the epigenetic level and the attitude. There are also the thoughts and feelings from the past, and they can get triggered with trauma. Patients, they can get triggered very quickly. And I also find that very interesting to see how the past is written down on the cell level, and that can be triggered by an impulse at the present time and then sends into the future. And in an extreme case, we know flashbacks from traumata patients. Where through routines, and constant doing the same, something, liveliness has been lost. These genetic codings keep bringing about the same patterns again and again, like in families where for generations there's stories of abuse, where there's experienced violence for generation after generation, and we know that ourselves. Sometimes we change the job or moved somewhere else, or we find ourselves in a new relationship, and certain patterns are still ongoing. So even though genetic and epigenetics are passed on through inheritance, so we often in our consciousness we relive the experiences of our predecessors. So knowing about epigenetics is great help to let go of any victim consciousness and to take it in our own hands to program the genes. And that's what we're doing here on our path of self-knowledge. But I find it super interesting that and inspiring that you can find it on the cell level as well. The finding of the intention, we said in the very beginning, life moves along the path of an intention and gets more and more complex and more complex structures. Also the feeling of this intention is not always easy in our own life. That's why even there it could be helpful to recognize this intention in the cells and to transfer them from there into the larger levels. Here I try to describe that. Goes from the little cell into the larger constructs, and then the quantum field, which gives inspiration to all of it and also receives inspiration. To go and follow behind the intention of life has always been a great intention. This exciting but often very laborious and difficult process of recognition has to go again and again through many bottlenecks, misinterpretations and wrong assumptions. Go through those to get to a larger understanding. Since the Middle Ages, there hasn't changed much as far as taboos and certain attitudes, and we experience that again, that wrong assumptions kept getting repeated and repeated, new insights get ignored, and people who are at the field of these get discredited and sometimes murdered. And sometimes we find it difficult to have these patterns which have gone down and written themselves into the level of the cells, that we question those and that we can dissolve them. A human who sees himself or herself as a single entity is actually a community, a very busy and efficiently organized community made of 50 to 90 billion cells. The body seems like a billion individuals that are happily cooperating under one roof and living together. And cell communities seem to work obviously better than the human. There's no homeless cells in the body and nobody gets excluded. Unless something goes very wrong, cells that separate themselves, such as cancer cells, they are recognized and are being dissolved. And that's also I found very interesting, that our physical health and also our spiritual health, as well from the building and also destructive forces, are important. Of course, in an illness they see building up and repairing forces, but also the ones are destroying, that are recognizing something is not functioning well anymore, and that are dissolving that. And I'd like to have a look at you when all cells have the same genome, and still one becomes a brain cell and one becomes a kidney cell. So again, every cell has an identical genome. We can see it's like a good stocked library with much information, and the individual books are like the chromosomes, and the chapters in the books would be the gene sequences that decide which proteins are being produced and determine which cell is made or comes out of the stem cell. So the chapter which is being read decides whether it's a brain cell, nerve cell, kidney cell, because all cells have an identical thread of DNA, and their diverse identity they only receive through epigenetic, which decides which sequence of the genes is being read now. In common terms, one calls them switches, and one imagines an on and off switch, but actually it's more like always in nature a continual process, and you could see the epigenetical process such like a dimmer with something that constantly read it of an intensity from 0 to 100%, and that you can imagine it optically a bit. This line here, that's the genetical sequence, and there's a predecessor, a docking place for epigenetics, for a protein that says either it's being read or it's not being read, and also the intensity to which it is being read. The individual cell is able to learn from experience, to store cellular remembrance and memory, and to also pass it on to the subjects of their progeny. For example, we know that if we are in contact with a virus, then the body produces different proteins, and the one that's the best can dock onto the intruder and dissolve it. This information is passed on to the next cells and also onto the offspring. And here's something else very interesting, and that is the gene researchers have found it's not just happening within one organism, but the genetical exchange and thus the information exchange will also happen between members of different kinds. The intelligence of nature of exchanging information, and we're talking about the hardware and the software, so what's on top of the genetics, the epigenetic, that not just the own kind profits by it, but the whole. Here, for example, we have on cellular level, we can see that and learn for the unparalleled intention of nature to cooperate. The genetical transfer and thus the information flow does not just apply for the intelligence of human, but also not just for the intelligence of nature, but the stupidity of human beings who are resisting to recognize the intention of the whole and to think that they know better. Now, there's a study that the genetically changed foods are really harmful to certain bacteria. Another way where we have been really intruded into our health is irresponsible use of antibiotics. It has made many bugs resistant, and they've become more aggressive. and it's a very large influence on our microbiome, which is out of balance very much now. The cellular biology shows how living beings on Earth are connected with each other and how existential this cooperation towards a revolutionary development is there for the whole and the well-being of the whole community of Earth and even beyond. To bring about communities reflects the imperative of the biological imperative of life. The better an organism can see and perceive its environment and cooperates with it, the larger its survival possibilities are. When cells join together, their perception gets enhanced exponentially, and when people come together, their power of perception also gets multiplied. Cooperation between different kinds is what nature does, and we see a lot of very astonishing examples from fauna and flora. And for example, you've found out about something that has been very much researched: the trees, how they communicate amongst each other, how they take care which trees should blossom again, which trees, how they work together with fungi under the earth, and what it does with our immune system when we take a walk in the woods. Another example are microorganisms in our body, especially those in our bowels. They are 10 times more than we have actually cells in our body, 500 billions. And because the body cannot live without its microbiome, it could be seen as an organism or a system of organs, and epigenetics found that our cells, our genetics are communicating with the genes in our microbiomes. And through this mechanism we can see how nutrition, through influence of microbiome, has an influence on our cell health. And I'd like to alarmingly say here the style of life, style of civilized living and world, that there has been a decrease of the different microbiotical cells of a reduction of 30 to 40%. There are studies with peoples that have had very little contact with the modern world, and they have multiple more microbes and different kinds of microbes than we have in our bowels. And you could see that in connection with the sixth wave of a great wave of extinguishing species, when people always he disturbs into this intention of nature to get more complex, poisons and enhancement of technology, then the consequences are an ailing, a stagnation, up to the destruction of the whole. And this we're thinking a lot about at the moment. And when I like to come back to this little drawing, I'd like to show one aspect, that living together in small groups, such as a culture of a tribe or a united knowledge of a people, so when we look at the exchange of information in a tribal culture, you can see how there's a minute play of cooperating happens between all species and living creatures, and this has been created in hundreds of years. We understand how it's been created, how it's been protected, and how it's been passed on. The better the frequency of transmitting and receiving, the more differentiating and the more harmonic and able to learn is the music, in quotes, which is in the intention of evolution as positive. When receptor and transmitter aren't able to communicate well anymore, there are results that are catastrophical. One example is the death of so many bees, resulting from the use of pesticides, but also microwave radiation. Bees communicate where they find food and the resources and how they pass on this message to the fellow bees. They also use finer energy levels, and this doesn't work so well anymore. They feel being attacked and they close up their own hive. They don't have enough food, they have less offspring, and they die. Another example with unthought of consequences in this whole is the politics of refugees, where people live in an area where they can't communicate with a morphogenetic field, and it comes to stress and tension. We know that with people migrational background and the results of that. We can see that in our practices. But also, at the same time, the quiet knowledge of tribes, that there's a threat of a lot of the culture being lost. Man's intervention brings about the extinction of many species. War destroys genetically values in the countries where they come from, and also in Germany, the flooding. I was at a talk by a historian that Germany, as I knew it, and as some of you, it's not existent anymore. And the question is, what do we do now with it? Another example of destroying quiet knowledge, the national park rangers talk about. It's Christina's favorite example. The amount of elephants in the reservation has grown too big. They didn't have any natural enemies, and so the caretakers decided they had to kill a few elephants, and they've decided, well, who shall we kill? And they thought, well, the easiest, the tribe can live without the old ladies that can't take care of progeny anymore and offspring, and they killed some of them. And then they were very astonished that the whole tribe, when trying to find water holes, they were very uncertain. They couldn't find the watering holes, so this quiet knowledge that had been there was being lost, and also the young bulls in their puberty, the tribe wasn't such able to correct them and to give them a stop or put them into their boundaries, so there has been a lot of chaotic energy. So that the rangers were realizing that the old elephant ladies had an invaluable influence on the whole. So we can imagine very concretely that there's a constant exchange of information between all living creatures, amongst each other, with the environment, something that we cannot hear, and on a level that we cannot hear or see or feel. nutrition specialists have found out that, for example, vegetables that we grow in our own garden has a more fitting structure with our own bodies than the vegetables we buy. More fitting structure makes a better music, and that is good for health. That for many, the multicultural person is actually a loss at diversity, and another, it should be cooperation and not making everything equal. And Darwin's sentence, we could rewrite the sentence, life is not a fight to survive, but it's a great cooperation to live and to survive. That we understand the purpose of life is not just on the material level, but it's a further chapter that epigenetics opens us up to, but that I cannot do at the moment because of time. But the intention of life is not primarily that survival in its own, but the enhancement and enlargement of complexity and the enhancement of consciousness that is being caused by diversity. This comes from the quantum field, and it's the thank you of the individual life towards the whole, not surviving materially, but the survival of information. And I've tried to show that, so the field of quantum inspires everything, our cells, the whole body, the whole human being, the animals, the plants. And via epigenetic we are returning what we have learned in our lives. We're passing it on to our offsprings, and that flows again into the quantum field, which is good for the whole and benefits the whole. And thus I'd like to close. Many thanks. It was very fun, much fun to read into it, and there's still a lot more power that is in this new young area of research.
Ja, also wir haben ein Lied mitgebracht.
So we brought a song.
Also den Text dazu habe ich vor ein paar Jahren geschrieben.
The text I wrote a few years ago when I had my first big biochemistry exam, and I was so upset that it was so one-sided in the library.
Melodie dazu zu schreiben. Es heißt Biochemistry.
It's called Biochemistry.
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 You say life is just 4 different parts of DNA, and that's probably true, and mighty clever too. But what about the miracle that makes us want to live? What about the part in us that proves that God exists? So tell me, how could you forget? Explain to me, how can you not get that to see the whole picture? It cannot have a frame. That for truth, to be honest, it must not have a name.
Say sex is simple, reward and reproduction, and you're right of course, and maybe even worse. You might really feel that way and will never know you're wrong, what it's really all about and why you're missing out. So tell me, how could you forget? Explain to me, how can you not get that you see the whole picture? It cannot have a frame. That for truth to be honest, it must not have a name.
You say love is only endorphins and evolution, and the theory is perfect. How could one object? But what about the lightning storm that makes us lose our minds? What about the inner force that leaves all thoughts behind? So tell me, how could you forget? Explain to me, how can you not get that you see the whole picture? It cannot have a frame. That for truth to be honest, it must not have a name.